There is a nation that holds a record no people on earth would choose to hold. In 301 CE, the Kingdom of Armenia became the first state in history to adopt Christianity as its official religion. Not privately, not as a tolerated faith among others, but as the declared religion of an entire political entity, more than a decade before Constantine legalized it across the Roman Empire. More than a century before Rome itself made it the empire's official creed, the Armenians were Christian before Christianity was safe. They have remained Christian through Zoroastrian persecution, through Arab conquest, through Mongol invasion, through 5 centuries of Ottoman rule, through genocide, through Soviet atheism. The faith survived everything. So did the people. And that survival, that extraordinary persistence against forces that destroyed larger and more powerful civilizations, is what makes the question the genetics eventually asked so unexpected. Because when researchers began mapping Armenian DNA with serious precision, they found something that nobody had thought to look for. The Armenians were not simply who they appeared to be. They were a living archive of a Bronze Age world that had vanished everywhere else. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the standard narrative about Armenian origins looked like before the genetics arrived. The Armenians, in the conventional account, were an Indo-European speaking people whose ancestors had arrived in the Armenian Highlands, sometime during the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, possibly migrating from the west, from Thrace or the broader Anatolian region, and settling in the mountainous territory between the Black Sea, the Caspian, and the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. Their language, Armenian, is an independent branch of the Indo-European family with no close relatives, a linguistic island in the same way that Greek is a linguistic island, the sole surviving representative of its own sub-branch of a vast family tree. Their homeland, the Armenian Highlands, sat at one of the most consequential crossroads in human history. To the south, Mesopotamia and the great river civilizations of Babylon and Assyria. To the west, Anatolia and eventually the Greek and Roman worlds. To the north, the Caucasus and the steppe peoples beyond. To the east, the Iranian plateau and the Persian empires. The highlands themselves, rising to over 4,000 meters at the summit of Mount Ararat, created a fortress landscape that the surrounding lowland powers found difficult to hold permanently, even when they could conquer it seasonally. The Urartian kingdom had controlled these highlands before the Armenians. The Medes had pushed through them. The Achaemenid Persians had incorporated them as a satrapy. Alexander the Great had passed through. The Seleucids had claimed them. The Romans had fought over them with the Parthians for centuries, treating Armenia as the perennial buffer zone between 2 empires that could never quite agree on where one ended and the other began. Through all of it, the Armenians had remained. They had traded with every civilization that surrounded them, been conquered by most of them, absorbed influences from each, and maintained the thread of their own identity across every transition. It was a compelling story. And when geneticists began probing it with ancient DNA, what they found confirmed parts of it and fundamentally transformed the rest. The key study arrived in 2015, published in the journal Nature, by a large collaborative team that included researchers from Harvard, the Broad Institute, and multiple European institutions. It was one of the most ambitious ancient DNA projects undertaken to that point, analyzing genomes from over 90 individuals spanning a geographic range from Europe to Central Asia and a time range from the Mesolithic to the early Iron Age. Among the individuals analyzed were ancient specimens from the Armenian Highlands itself, drawn from Bronze Age burials in what is today Armenia and neighboring regions of the southern Caucasus. What those Bronze Age Armenian specimens revealed was striking in its specificity. The ancient Armenians of the Bronze Age, the people living in the highlands 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, showed a genetic profile that was a distinctive mixture of 3 ancestry streams. The first was Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry, a lineage specific to the mountainous Caucasus region, a population that had lived in relative isolation from the broader sweep of Eurasian prehistory, and that contributed a genetic component found nowhere else on Earth at the same frequency. The second was ancestry related to the Neolithic farmers of the Fertile Crescent, the populations from which agriculture itself had spread across the ancient world. The third was a component related to the early pastoralists of the Pontic steppe, the same population whose migrations across Eurasia had spread into European languages from Ireland to India. This three-way mixture was not unusual for the Bronze Age Near East in the broadest sense. What was unusual was the specific proportions and the specific character of the Caucasian hunter-gatherer component, which was present in the ancient Armenian specimens at levels that separated them from every neighboring ancient population. The Armenian Highlands, in the ancient DNA record, show up not as a passive crossroads through which other people's histories flowed, but as a distinct genetic zone with its own specific character. Shaped by a Caucasian population whose deep roots in those mountains predated every historical civilization that had ever risen and fallen in the surrounding lowlands. But here is where the story takes a turn that the 2015 study itself had not fully anticipated, and that subsequent research made increasingly clear. When researchers compared the ancient Bronze Age Armenian specimens to modern Armenians living today, they found a degree of genetic continuity that was remarkable even by the standards of a region famous for remarkable continuity. Modern Armenians cluster more closely with their Bronze Age ancestors than almost any other modern population clusters with its ancient counterpart in the same region. The Anatolians of today bear little genetic resemblance to the Anatolians of the Bronze Age, who were replaced by successive waves of migration and conquest. The populations of the Fertile Crescent have been transformed by millennia of movement and mixing. But the Armenians, in their highland fortress of mountains, maintained a genetic thread connecting them to the Bronze Age world of their ancestors with a fidelity that the genetics describe as almost without parallel in the ancient Near East. This is the Hittite connection, and it is the detail that changes everything. The Hittites were the dominant power of Bronze Age Anatolia, the empire that fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, the civilization that produced the world's first surviving peace treaty. The culture that used iron weapons before iron was common in any other military force. They vanished around 200 BCE, in the same catastrophic Bronze Age collapse that ended the Mycenaean civilization, disrupted Egypt, and erased nearly every major palace culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. No modern population has ever been clearly identified as the direct genetic descendants of the Hittites. Their language Hittite, the oldest recorded Indo-European language, died with their empire. But the Bronze Age ancient DNA record places the Armenian Highlands in direct genetic proximity to the Anatolian Bronze Age world from which the Hittites emerged. The ancient Armenians and the ancient Anatolian populations of the late Bronze Age share genetic components that link them in ways the historical record alone could never have revealed. The Armenians are not the Hittites, but they are, in a genetic sense, the closest surviving relatives of the world that produced the Hittites. They carry in their contemporary genomes a degree of continuity with the Bronze Age Near East that has survived everything the subsequent 3,000 years of history threw at them: Persian conquest, Macedonian conquest, Roman occupation, Arab conquest, Seljuk invasion, Mongol devastation, Ottoman domination, and genocide, the deliberate attempt to erase a people entirely, carried out between 1915 and 1923, which killed an estimated 1.5 million Armenians and displaced the majority of the population from its ancestral homeland in eastern Anatolia. Of all the historical forces that might have been expected to break the genetic thread connecting modern Armenians to their Bronze Age ancestors, that genocide might have seemed the most likely to succeed. A deliberate campaign of extermination targeting a specific people in their ancestral homeland, in theory, be the kind of event that ruptures biological continuity in ways that centuries of ordinary conquest do not. It did not. The populations that survived, that reconstituted Armenian communities in what is today the Republic of Armenia, in diaspora communities across Russia, Lebanon, Syria, France, and the Americas. And in the descendants of those communities now living across the world, carried the same genetic signatures their ancestors had carried in the highlands 3,000 years before. The population was displaced. The DNA was not. It traveled through the catastrophe intact, passed from parent to child in refugee camps and foreign cities and communities that kept the language alive and the church open and the memory of a homeland burning in people who had never seen it and whose children's children have still never seen it. The genetics survived all of that. It survives still. There is something in this that goes beyond the strictly scientific. When a 2015 genetics paper reports that modern Armenians show unusually high continuity with Bronze Age populations of the Armenian Highlands, it is reporting a biological fact. But it is also, obliquely and without intending to, reporting something about what it means for a people to persist. The Armenians did not persist because history was kind to them. History was almost maximally unkind to them. They persisted because persistence is something a people can choose, across generations, in the face of forces designed to prevent it. The genetics are the biological record of that choice. The DNA does not lie about this. It does not simplify it either. What it tells us is that the people who first declared Christianity the law of their land in 301 CE, who have carried that faith and that identity through every catastrophe the subsequent 17 centuries produced, are also, in their bones and their blood, the closest living connection to a Bronze Age world that history declared finished more than 3,000 years ago. The Armenians were never simply what the history books described. They were never simply a small nation at a crossroads, buffeted by larger empires, surviving by accommodation and stubbornness. They were and are a living bridge across one of the longest gaps in the documented human past, connecting the Bronze Age world of Hittites and early Mesopotamian civilizations to the present day through an unbroken biological thread that no conquest and no genocide was ever able to fully cut. The data is telling us that some things are more durable than empires. Some things travel through time in forms that violence cannot reach.